Welcome everyone to the fourth part of the lecture Intersectional Ecology for a Politics of Equality. This part is about inequalities in times of pandemics and climate change. And this part of the lecture argues for the need to analyze COVID-19 and the ecological and climate crisis together. But let me start with the words of the co-chairs of the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBES. I quote, "There is a single species that is responsible for the COVID-19 pandemic, us. As with the climate and biodiversity crisis, recent pandemics are a direct consequence of human activity, particularly our global financial and economic systems based on a limited paradigm that prizes economic growth at any cost. More than 70% of all emerging diseases affecting people having originated in wildlife and domesticated animals. Rampant deforestation, uncontrolled expansion of agriculture, intensive farming, mining and infrastructure development, as well as the exploitation of wild species, have created a perfect storm for the spillover of diseases from wildlife to people. This is the human hand in pandemic emergence. This intergovernmental platform convened the world's best scientists for a workshop on the pandemic to put together all the available evidence on the biodiversity and pandemics. And I will heavily draw on their findings in this part of the lecture. In their reports, they argue for the importance to prevent pandemics. Without preventative strategies, pandemics will emerge more often and spread more rapidly, kill more people, and affect the global economy with more devastating impact than ever before. Current pandemic strategies rely on responding to diseases after their emergence, with public health measures and technological solutions, in particular the rapid design and distribution of new vaccines and therapeutics. However, COVID-19 demonstrates that this is a slow and uncertain path. And as the global population waits for vaccine to become available, the human costs are mounting in lives lost, sickness endured, economic collapse, and loss of livelihoods. And an interesting conclusion of the report is that pandemics have their origins in diverse microbes carried by animal reservoirs, but their emergence is entirely, remember this word, driven by human activities. The underlying causes of pandemics are the same global environmental changes that drive biodiversity loss and climate change. These include land use change, agricultural expansion and intensification, and wildlife trade and consumption. I think it's really very interesting to see how the same stuff that drives climate change also is what creates pandemics. And these drivers include land use change, agricultural expansion, and wildlife trade and consumption, as I just mentioned. These drivers bring wildlife, livestock, and people into closer contact, allowing animal microbes to move into people and lead to infections, sometimes outbreaks, and more rarely into true pandemics. More than 70% of emerging diseases for example, Ebola, Zika, and almost all known pandemics, for example, influenza, HIV/AIDS, COVID-19, are zoonoses. These are diseases caused by microbes of animal origin. And an estimated 1.7 million undiscovered viruses are thought to exist in mammals and avian hosts. Of these, between a third and a half could have the ability to infect humans. More than 5 new diseases emerge in people every year, any one of which has the potential to become a pandemic. Unsustainable exploitation of the environment due to land use change, agricultural expansion and intensification, wild trade consumption and other drivers disrupts natural interaction among wildlife and their microbes, increasing contact among wildlife, livestock, people, and their pathogens, and has led to almost all pandemics. Climate change also plays a part in disease emergence and will likely cause substantial future pandemic risk by driving movement of people, wildlife, reservoirs, and vectors, and spread of their pathogens in ways that lead to new contact among species, increased contact among species, or otherwise disrupts the natural host pathogen dynamics. And both land use change and climate change will likely create novel wildlife communities, new relationships among wildlife, human, and livestock populations, and increase the potential for cross-species transmissions. Land use change is globally a significant driver of pandemics and caused the emergence of more than 30% of new diseases reported since 1960. Land use change includes deforestation, the growth of crop and livestock production, human settlement in primarily wildlife habitat, and urbanization. Pandemic risk could significantly lower by promoting responsible consumption and reducing unsustainable consumption of commodities from emerging disease hotspots and wildlife, as well as by reducing the excessive consumption of meat from livestock production. The rising demand for meat in developing countries and emerging economies has continued to push an unsustainable global system of intensive production that threatens biodiversity and contributes to climate change. For example, global demand for meat has indirectly and directly led to deforestation, forest degradation, and expansion of pasture in Brazil and other parts of the Amazon. By forming unnaturally dense assemblages of often closely related individuals, livestock farming has historically driven the emergence of pathogens within the domesticated species. However, the increasing expansion of livestock and poultry production, the increase in the size and acreage of farms, and in the number of individual animals at a site have led to increasing potential for transmission of pathogens to people. For example, the emergence of salmonellosis, bovine spongiform encephalopathy, and the variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, and some strains of antimicrobial resistant pathogens. It has also led to pathogens emergence across the wildlife, livestock, human interface. This is very relevant because the emergence of novel strains of influenza has been linked to a reassortment of viral genes following viral transmission among large poultry flocks, mixing with wild birds, pig herds, and people. That is, pathogens that from wildlife, they get into farm animal where they mutate before moving back to human. and the emergence of Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome, MERS, in people was due to precisely the transmission of a coronavirus that is likely of bat origins, but then became endemic in domesticated camels, allowing repeated transmission to people. In February 2021, the outbreaks of bird flu continue to be reported across Europe. Sweden was reported to be planning to cull about 1.3 million chickens after bird flu was found on a farm. In Asia, South Korea is reported to be culling 19 million poultry to control bird flu outbreaks. Denmark culled millions of minks farmed for their fur because COVID-19 transmitted from humans to minks and could come back to humans in a mutated form that could jeopardize the global effectiveness of vaccines. But instead of stopping this cruel animal farming practice forever, they are now developing a COVID-19 vaccine for minks. There are not enough vaccine for people, and instead of using this capacity for people, we look for vaccine for minks so that we can continue to farm and kill them for fur. In January 2021, a new strain of the African swine fever was discovered in China. The disease has spread in Europe with pigs culled everywhere. This after fever affected China very badly in 2018. Again, instead of any rethinking, the growth in production continued, and China alone slaughtered 527 million hogs in 2020. And this on top of importing a record 4.4 million tons of pork. More than 500,000 pigs have been culled in Russia after an outbreak of the deadly pig disease, the African swine fever. And sector experts think that Germany is unlikely to be able to eradicate the disease now. Meanwhile, in China, new outbreaks and mutation of the virus are being reported as I'm delivering this lecture. While we know that deforestation is a major cause of climate change and COVID, China and Europe import most Brazilian soya to feed animals, soya that comes from the destruction of forests. The world's largest meat producer, JBS, sourced cattle from supplier farms that made use of workers kept in slavery-like conditions. We know how living close to animal farms affects the health of people. In the Netherlands, the outbreak of Q fever, a respiratory disease affected goats, lasted from 27 to 2010. During this period, tens of thousands of dairy goats were culled to contain the spread of the disease. Half of the people infected developed complications, including heart failure, with 95 confirmed deaths. 10 years later, those living close to goat farms in the Netherlands have up to 55% higher risk of developing pneumonia, with risk increasing the closer they live to the farms. And this could be a new zoonotic disease. Similarly, we know that children raised on the grounds of a typical hog factory farm have asthma rates exceeding 50%, and children raised near factory farms are twice as likely to develop asthma. We prefer to see our parents and grandparents die of COVID, have our freedom cuts, destroy the chances of a habitable planet for our children, destroy and create untold unnecessary suffering of sentient beings smarter than our pets, all of these for palate pleasure, gluttony of eating animals that is causing ourselves cancers, cardiovascular diseases, and diabetes. But we have to learn fast from the current situation and shift to prevention. I argue that to shift from emergency response to prevention, we need to analyze COVID-19 and the ecological climate as one crisis through the same lens. These also involve a shift in global ethics and social norms that is needed to protect the long-term well-being of people and the planet. And this is because durable solutions to both COVID-19 and other pandemics and to the climate crisis require global collective action. And this is possible with a shift in ethics and social norms. What is astonishing is that the same environmental changes that threaten biodiversity loss on a global scale are also driving the increasing spillover, amplification, and spread of novel viral diseases. These include land use change, such as deforestation or encroachment into wildlife habitat, climate change and sustainable trade and consumption of wildlife, agriculture intensification, globalized trade and travel. Another interesting consideration from the Intergovernmental Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem is that the economic damages from emerging diseases are similar in magnitude to those of climate change. In October 2020, the International Monetary Fund estimated an economic loss of $28 trillion for COVID-19. And this doesn't count the millions of families mourning their deaths and the many more millions living with lifelong debilitating conditions, the so-called long COVID. And the conservative WWF charity patronized by Prince Philip is writing, COVID-19 is a devastating wake-up call that humanity's broken relationship with nature affects not only the wildlife and natural ecosystem whose habitats are being destroyed, but also threatens human health. By continuing to damage natural habitats, humans risk incurring the terrible costs of new zoonotic diseases, as well as increased exposure to other threats, such as climate change. Beyond the devastating costs of COVID-19, WWF argues that the same forces driving an increased risk of pandemics are also exacerbating the current planetary emergency of nature loss and climate change, putting the health of current and future generations at risk. Land conversion for food and livestock production is destroying natural habitats. The amount of land converted for food and livestock production is increasing at a rapid rate in order to feed a growing population. Since 1990, 180 million hectares of forest have been cleared, which is the equivalent of the size of Libya, which is the 80th largest country in the world, a huge country. Most habitat loss associated with agriculture is attributed to just 3 commodities: beef, soy, and palm oil. The soy being mostly used to feed livestock. And while there are a variety of uses for palm oil, adding palm oil-based energy supplements to cow feed is a decades-old practice to increase milk output. While the frequencies of diseases originating in animals has increased exponentially, the fact that human diseases are linked to our problematic relationship with animals is not new. In their fantastic history of humanity, Lewis and Maslin explain the sudden death of 10% of the world's population. 90% of the population in the Americas who died, and estimated to be between 50 and 80 million, and they died after the arrival of Europeans on the continent, and they died largely due to zoonotic diseases. While over thousands of years, humans in the rest of the planet had built some resistance to the many diseases from animals, for example, influenza, smallpox, and measles. In the Americas, they had only domesticated the llama. And the epidemiologist Nathan Wolf and colleagues, they studied 25 diseases which have created the greatest burden throughout histories. Out of these 25 major diseases, only one, Chagas disease, clearly originated in the Americas. 18 of the major pathogens originated in Eurasia and Africa. And the disparity is thought to be because Eurasia and Africa had more domesticated animals within which diseases could develop and mutate to infect humans. Out of the world's 14 major species of domestic mammal livestock, the only species from the Americas is the llama, which has not infected us with pathogens, perhaps because it has never been milked, ridden, or kept indoors near people. And the other 13 species, including the 5 most abundant species with which we come into closest contact, that is cow, sheep, goat, pig, and horse, they originated in Eurasia and probably incubated disease that then spread to humans. I want now to speak about the importance of biodiversity. Humanity relies on the Earth's natural system to regulate the environment and maintain a habitable planet. The diversity of life, that is biodiversity, in a given region creates ecosystem of interactive individual organisms across many species that collectively contribute to and support key planetary processes. For example, terrestrial and marine ecosystem remove more than 60% of carbon emissions from the atmosphere every year. And thus they play a crucial role in regulating the Earth's surface temperature. Natural or natural derived compounds account for 75% of approved antimicrobial drugs. For example, there may be 12 million fungal species, one of which was the source of penicillin, used to control bacterial infection and revolutionize medicine. But unfortunately, around a quarter of species in most animal and plant groups are already under threat from extinction, and around 1 million more species face extinction within decades. Let's think that since 1970, the population size of mammals, birds, fish, amphibians, and reptiles have seen an alarming average drop of about 70%. Half of habitable land is used for agriculture, which includes, and when I talk about habitable land, that includes roads, rivers, forests, lakes, and half of that is used just by agriculture. 80% of which by farmed animals, meat, and dairy, which produce only 1/8% of global calorie supply. It is a very inefficient system. It takes 100 calories fed to a cow to produce 1 calorie for human consumption. And this leads us to discuss the food system. We have a clear diagnosis. What can be the solution? And I want to focus for a second on the food system, which produces about 30% of emissions. The World Health Organization calls for a One Health approach, putting at the center the health of humans, the health of animals, and the health of planets, recognizing the interconnectedness and interdependence of all living species and the environment. And Chatham House, probably the most recognized conservative policy institutes in the UK, the most deal with security and foreign policy, they felt they had to dedicate a report to the food system and its impacts on biodiversity loss. The report shows how the reduction of food prices was achieved by externalizing costs of environmental degradation and resulting from food production have not been accounted and included in the cost of food. Financial incentives such as agricultural subsidies are channeled into the food system to increase yields, disregarding the resulting environmental costs. The concentration and intensification of agriculture have driven down the cost of staples such as grains, which are now sufficiently cheap to be diverted from direct human consumptions to farmed animals. And this has led to growth in the global herd of farmed animals with negative consequences for air, water quality, and climate altering emissions. The global food system, as I said, now account for 30% of total anthropogenic emissions and is a key driver of climate change. Climate change is reducing crops yields and nutritional quality across many regions, thereby further increasing the pressure to intensify production or convert more land to agriculture. Accounting for the true cost of food is thus necessary if incentives in the system are to be realigned to promote environmental and human well-being. I quote from Chatham House, "Without reform, our food system biodiversity loss, without reform of our food system, biodiversity loss will continue to accelerate. Further destruction of ecosystems and habitats will threaten our ability to sustain human populations." Firstly, global dietary patterns need to converge around diets based more on plants, owing to the disproportionate impact of animal farming on biodiversity, land use, and the environment. Such a shift would also benefit the dietary health of populations around the world and help reduce the risk of pandemics. Global food waste must be reduced significantly. The protection and setting aside of land for nature and the shift to nature-friendly farming both depend on dietary change. And we have clear evidence of increased morbidity and mortality across increased morbidity and mortality among COVID-19 sufferers who are malnourished, either undernourished or obese. And this is throwing light on the very real societal costs of our kind of food system. Approximately, and of course also not just on our current food system, but the cost of our patterns of consumption. Approximately 3 billion people suffer from one or more manifestations of poor nutrition. undernutrition, including deficiency of vitamins and minerals, and overweight or obesity. And these problems alone cost the world an estimated 3.5 trillion every year. Compared to the scale of the damage of pandemics, the funds allocated for economic recovery, funds that are allocated to environment and or health are incredibly small. The IMF estimates that 11.7 trillions have been pledged globally by September 2020 to support recovery from COVID-19. And this is again according to Chatham House. This is 19,500 217 times the estimated annual cost of halting deforestation in the Amazon. And this is, according to Chatham House, between 28 to 48 times the annual cost of climate change mitigation anticipated for 2030. And let's now think a little bit about an example of co-benefit. The measure to preserve the planet, preventing pandemics, climate change, and protecting biodiversity, promoting people's health and well-being, involves transforming diets that make people healthier. Healthier vegan diets are also with a lower environmental impact. A reduction in consumption can be achieved by internalizing the cost of meat and other animal products, taking away subsidies and taxing meat appropriately. For example, the True Animal Protein Price Coalition produced an important report in 2020. It's called Aligning Food Pricing Policy with the European Green Deal through pricing of meat and dairy in Europe. They try to include the CO2 cost into the price of products. And for example, they show how 400 grams of Gouda cheese that cost 1.99 euros, now if you account for this cost, has a price tag of 3.74 euros. A packet of long life milk that is available for 79 cents costs 1.75 euros, according to the true price. And 500 grams of minced meat that normally costs 2.79 euros, the real price is significantly higher, is 7.65 euros. And this price only takes into account emissions, but do not take into account the additional negative impacts such as pollution, health, use of water, etc. Moreover, animal agriculture should be treated like the tobacco or fossil fuel industry, damaging industries from which we need to divest. In the past 5 years, a new report confirms that meat and dairy companies globally receive at least $480 billion of investment from firms, banks, and pension funds. While divesting from fossil fuel is now a well-debated topic, the food system, which generates about 30% of global greenhouse emissions, is hardly discussed. University endowments, pension funds are investing in meat producers, including some of the companies directly linked to deforestation. But we are seeing the first signs of change. France's largest bank, BNP Paribas, has declared that it will stop funding companies producing or buying either beef or soya beans cultivated on land in the Amazon, cleared or converted after 2028. Instead of taxing behavior and process that increase pandemic and climate change risk, including animal farming and meat consumptions, these industries are heavily subsidized. Not only they don't absorb any of the environmental costs, but they receive money. And the cheap subsidized corn in the US and other agricultural subsidies are those who allows the cheap meat revolution, destroying the planet and health of North Americans. In the EU, the situation is not better. With the European agricultural policy is giving 20% of the European Union budget directly to livestock. People in all sectors of society are beginning to look for solutions that move beyond business as usual. To do this, we require transformative change, using the evidence from science to reassess the relationship between people and nature, and to reduce global environmental changes that are caused by unsustainable consumption and which drive biodiversity loss, climate change, and pandemic emergence. The causes of pandemics are very linked to the causes of climate change and biodiversity loss. We are the cause. The costs of both pandemic and climate change impacts will increase and will be unfairly distributed. The scale of these costs are similar. In this sense, this pandemic gave us a bitter taste of the future. The costs of pandemic, already insanely high, will be higher in the long term due to the projected increase in frequency. The current economic and food systems incentivize the wrong behaviors. For taste and habit, we are willing to sacrifice what we hold most precious: our future and the lives of our children.